As an African, I stand here as one of the trumpet voices of Africa, a continent all too often treated with affable indifference. Africa's voice is not heard. This United Nations cannot be truly international. It cannot be truly together and will not be better until our continent, home to 1/5 of the population of the world, is afforded an equal voice at the highest body of this organization.
They expected another polite African speech, a thank you tour for the same thieves who looted the continent. Instead, Botswana's president stood at the UN and set the room on fire. No begging, no bowing, no development partners. Just truth, raw, unfiltered, and long overdue. He didn't speak for applause. He spoke for vengeance disguised as vision. Every word cut through hypocrisy like a machete through silk. For once, Africa wasn't asking for inclusion. It was demanding a reckoning. And that's what burns them most, that the continent they mocked, robbed, and lectured now speaks like an equal. Because the age of pity is over. The age of payback has begun. And how is the West reacting? Let's find out. They expected another polite African speech, one that begins with gratitude, bows to donors, and ends with promises to do better. Instead, Botswana's president walked to the UN podium and detonated a truth bomb. Our vision is clear: to diversify our economy, empower our people, and create resilience. It wasn't a request, it was a declaration of independence.
Our vision is clear: to diversify our economy, empower our people, and create resilience. We invite global partners to invest in renewable energy, technology, sustainable agriculture, and value-added industries. We extend an open hand to businesses, innovators, and institutions ready to walk with us on this journey of transformation.
For decades, Africa was trapped in a theater of humiliation called international cooperation. Western nations arrived with cameras and contracts, always offering help that somehow helped them more. They spoke of development, but what they built were dependencies. They handed us loans wrapped in velvet, then stole our futures in the fine print. And every time Africa tried to rise, they called it instability. Every time Africa spoke, they called it anger. But Botswana's tone shattered that script. When the president invited the world to invest in renewable energy, technology, sustainable agriculture, and value-added industries, he was not begging for investors. He was warning the exploiters. The days of digging Africa's mines and selling back the finished products at 10 times the price are numbered. If you want in now, you come as a partner, not a predator. This is Africa's new diplomacy: trade without tribute. The open hand Botswana extended wasn't a symbol of need, it was a handshake of equals. The message was clear: either respect our sovereignty or watch us build without you. Because Africa has finally realized that the only way to stop being managed is to start managing itself. What unsettles the West isn't Africa's poverty, it's Africa's potential. A continent with 60% of the world's arable land, half its youth, and nearly all the minerals required for the so-called Green Revolution is beginning to act like it knows its worth. And worth is dangerous. It makes a servant unmanageable. When Botswana spoke of resilience, it wasn't speaking of endurance but of evolution, the kind born from centuries of betrayal. Colonization taught us exploitation, independence taught us disappointment. Now, necessity is teaching us power. Africa is done being a project. It's becoming a precedent. The empire that once lectured us on fiscal discipline is drowning in debt. The nations that warned us about corruption now bail out their own banks with stolen tax money. And yet, they dare call themselves developed. Developed at what? At hypocrisy. Botswana's statement wasn't only for investors, it was for Africans listening at home. It said, "You are not helpless. You are the future they fear." That single line of truth turned a routine address into a revolution. But here's the question that lingers after the applause fades. How did Africa become so unbreakable, so patient, so determined to rebuild even after centuries of plunder? What kind of strength grows from such relentless pain?
Botswana is a semi-arid country Our people know the meaning of drought. We know the anxiety of scarce water, of crops that wilt and wither under a relentless sun, of livelihoods eroded by forces beyond our control. Climate change is not a distant threat, it is a present reality. That is why I've joined the Global Center for Adaptation, because adaptation must be at the center of sustainable development. I call on this assembly to scale up financing for climate adaptation. Let us invest in water infrastructure.
Botswana is a semi-arid country, the president said. A simple statement, but in Africa, those words are loaded with history, grief, and genius. Because a semi-arid land doesn't just shape the soil, it shapes the soul. Botswana, like much of Africa, was born into scarcity. It knows the rattle of empty water drums, the whisper of dying crops, and the cruel rhythm of drought. Yet somehow, the people endure. They don't just survive, they evolve. The West talks about resilience as a buzzword. For Africans, it's anatomy. Our resilience isn't written in policies, it's written in our veins. We've survived the sun when the clouds refused to come. We've survived hunger when the world called it mismanagement. And while others wrote reports on climate change, we were already living through it. When Botswana's president said, "Climate change is not a distant threat, it is a present reality," he was holding up a mirror to the world's hypocrisy. Because let's be honest, Africa didn't create this crisis. We contributed less than 4% of global emissions. Yet somehow, we're the first to burn. The same nations that industrialized on African coal, oil, and rubber now tell us to stop developing for the sake of the planet they destroyed. The nerve of it, to pollute for centuries, then preach purity to the victims. That's why Botswana's call for investment in water infrastructure, early warning systems, and climate-smart agriculture wasn't charity-seeking. It was debt collection. Climate reparations aren't a radical idea, they're overdue justice. The carbon footprint that choked the skies was made in the factories of Europe, not the farms of Africa. You can't set the house on fire and then scold the tenants for sweating, but Africa is done waiting for rescue. From Morocco's Noor solar complex, the largest on Earth, to Kenya's geothermal power, from Namibia's green hydrogen projects to Botswana's smart irrigation systems, Africa is showing the world how to live within the planet's limits. While Western leaders argue about carbon credits, African scientists are inventing survival itself. The desert made us visionaries. It taught us that scarcity isn't weakness, it's the birthplace of innovation. It's why we can grow food in sand, generate light from wind, and create hope from hardship. The same land they called barren now holds the blueprint for the future. And yet, even as Africa proves its strength, another kind of drought still grips us. Not of water, but of fairness. Because every time we adapt, every time we rise, the system changes the rules. When we grow food, they flood us with subsidized imports. When we make progress, they raise the interest rates. And when we fight disease, they hold the cure hostage. So we must ask, what good is resilience if the world's systems are designed to keep you crawling? What happens when even survival becomes a luxury controlled by others? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue.
Earlier this year, Botswana faced an acute shortage of essential medicines. This crisis exposed not only the vulnerabilities of our supply chains, but the wider inequities of the global health system. Access to medicines is a human right, not a privilege. We call upon the United Nations, international financial institutions, and the private sector to work with us to build resilient health systems. Together, let us explore local production, regional supply hubs, and fairer mechanisms to ensure that no nation is left to face health emergencies alone.
Earlier this year, Botswana faced an acute shortage of essential medicines. The president said it calmly, but every African leader listening knew exactly what he meant. It wasn't just a shortage, it was a slow-motion strangling of sovereignty. Because when a nation can't access medicine, it doesn't just lose health, it loses control. And that right there is how the world keeps Africa on its knees. The Western world likes to speak of global health as if it's an act of compassion. In reality, it's business, brutal, profitable business. Life-saving drugs have become assets. Diseases are markets. The more desperate the patients, the higher the prices. That's why when Botswana's hospitals ran out of critical medicines, no one in the so-called developed world rushed to help. They were too busy protecting patents. They call it intellectual property. Africans call it what it is, legalized greed. When the president declared access to medicine is a human right, not a privilege, it wasn't rhetoric, it was rebellion. Because the pharmaceutical empire doesn't want equality, it wants dependency. The same corporations that boast about innovation lock their formulas behind paywalls. And when Africa dares to ask for manufacturing rights, they whisper about intellectual theft. Imagine that the descendants of colonizers accuse the colonized of theft. Botswana's call to build resilient health systems and explore local production wasn't about technical reform, it was about political revolution. Health isn't just about hospitals, it's about freedom. When we produce our own vaccines, we don't just save lives, we dismantle an empire. That's why the global system resists it. Dependency is the most efficient form of domination. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the world exposed its moral bankruptcy. Western nations hoarded vaccines by the millions, while Africa waited and buried its dead. They vaccinated their pets before they vaccinated our doctors. And then they called us unprepared. The same pattern repeats with medicines, diagnostics, and equipment. The rich hoard, the poor endure, and the world calls it market dynamics. But Africa is learning. From South Africa's mRNA hub to Rwanda's vaccine manufacturing facilities, from Nigeria's drug plants to Egypt's biomedical centers, the continent is quietly cutting the oxygen line of dependency. The age of begging for pills is ending. Soon, the same nations that refuse to share patents will be buying from African factories. Still, the question remains: who designed this cruel order? Who decided that health, climate, and trade must all obey the same hierarchy of power, where a few countries dictate who gets to survive and who gets to suffer? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now.
Friends and partners in the Permanent Five, it is time to make good on your promise to a continent. Agree a permanent seat on the UN Security Council for Africa, for 80 years the only continent without one.
When Botswana's president said, "Africa's voice is not heard," the hall froze. The diplomats looked down at their notes. The interpreters hesitated mid-sentence. Because he had just broken the one rule of global diplomacy: don't say the truth out loud. For 80 years, the United Nations has been sold as the home of equality. But in reality, it's a gated community for the powerful. Africa, the cradle of humankind, home to 1.4 billion people, has no permanent seat on the Security Council. None. Yet, the same nations that carved up its borders, looted its wealth, and now depend on its resources get to decide its fate. They call it global order. We call it what it is: colonialism with microphones. The United Nations loves to talk about reform, as long as reform means rearranging chairs, not redistributing power. They organize conferences, issue reports, and release roadmaps for inclusion. But at the end of every summit, the same five powers keep their vetoes, and Africa keeps its silence. Botswana's president didn't ask for a favor, he demanded justice. This United Nations cannot be truly international, he said, until our continent is afforded an equal voice. And what was the reaction? Applause, of course, that hollow diplomatic applause that sounds like respect, but means this will be ignored. The Permanent Five, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China nodded politely, knowing they'd veto the idea before it reached the agenda. For them, Africa's role is to vote, not to veto, to obey, not to decide. But times are changing. The age of silent Africa is ending, because power, like nature, abhors a vacuum, And where the UN excludes us, Africa is building its own alliances. The African Union is evolving into something stronger. BRICS is widening its doors. The African Continental Free Trade Area is merging economies faster than colonial borders can divide them. A new architecture is forming, brick by brick, and it doesn't require approval from New York. The West calls this dangerous. Of course it does. Any world where Africa speaks for itself is dangerous to those who profit from its silence. But Botswana's statement wasn't just defiance, it was prophecy. The next time Africa comes to the table, it won't be asking for a seat. It will be bringing its own. And the irony? The UN's refusal to reform is what will make it irrelevant. Because how long can an institution claim to represent the world while excluding 1/5 of it? How long before the ignored become the unstoppable? That question no longer hangs in the air. It burns in Africa's chest. The world order built on our suffering is cracking. And when the cracks become a collapse, the silence will finally end, not with permission, but with revolution. Which brings us to the final truth. What happens when Africa stops knocking and starts building its own door? That's not just hope. That's the age of African reckoning. When you connect it all, Botswana's defiance, Africa's survival through the desert, the fight for medical sovereignty, and the call to break the UN's silence, one truth emerges. Africa has finally had enough. This is no longer a story of endurance. It's the dawn of retaliation, moral, economic, and intellectual. The world that once called Africa the future is now realizing that the future doesn't wait. It arrives on its own terms. Botswana didn't just speak for itself. It spoke for every African nation that has been treated like a spectator in its own destiny. The president's words were calm, but behind them was centuries of rage disguised as composure. The speech was the sound of a continent that no longer asks, when will they listen? But rather, why should we care if they don't? The Western world trembles not because Africa is weak, but because Africa is waking. They sense it in the trade deals shifting east, in the African leaders refusing IMF conditions, in the youth demanding industries over aid. The machine of manipulation is breaking down. You can see it in the numbers. African economies are growing faster than Europe's. African innovation is outpacing Western investment. The same powers that once sold us progress are now borrowing it from us. Botswana's message was never about vengeance. It was about value. The continent that powered their revolutions is now building its own. The same gold they stole now backs our banks. The same sun they ignored now fuels our grids. The same soil they looted now feeds our industries. The empire is running out of Africa to exploit, and it doesn't know how to function without it. The West will soon learn what Africa has always known. You cannot bury a continent that grows in every direction. From Ouagadougou to Addis Ababa, from Gaborone to Kinshasa, a quiet unity is taking shape. It's not political unity, not yet. It's psychological. Africans have stopped believing the lie that salvation comes from elsewhere. That shift alone changes everything. Botswana's speech was the sound of that awakening, the sound of Africa reclaiming its narrative. And make no mistake, once Africa controls its narrative, it controls its future. Because everything begins with how you are seen, and Africa is done being seen as a victim. So let this be clear. The next time an African leader stands at that UN podium, it won't be to plead for inclusion or equality. It will be announced that the table is being rebuilt, in Africa, for Africa, by Africa. And when the rest of the world comes knocking, we'll finally get to ask the question we've waited 500 years to ask, what can you offer us? Because the age of charity is over. The age of African reckoning has begun. How long did they think Africa would stay silent while being robbed blind? Why do they fear an Africa that no longer needs saving? Let us know in the comments section. When Africa finally stands tall, who will they lecture then? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.